Today, a church under siege with accusations flying and criticism directed at the highest levels of priestly power. How will the church restore trust? Welcome to Listen Up. I'm Lorna Duick. Today we turn our attention to the scandal-plagued Catholic Church. We've brought together an expert panel to discuss how the Church is facing its shame for the acts perpetrated by its clergy and for its response to their victims. We're joined by Robert Berube, a former school principal. He's with the Survivors Network of those abused by priests. Robert was sexually abused by a priest beginning when he was 13 and says the experience cost him his faith. Also, Joanne McGarry. She's executive director of the Catholic Civil Rights League, a national lay organization for Catholics. And finally, Father Len Artilia, a Jesuit priest for 12 years who has handled allegations of misconduct for the order. Robert, let's start with you. Your experience with sexual abuse in the Catholic Church has put you in contact with over 400 people who have had similar experiences. What are you hearing from victims?
I'm hearing horror stories from them because of the way the Church handles what has happened to them. The minute they do come out and say, I've been abused and I need help, I've heard horror stories.
And what have they lost?
They've lost everything. Survivors, you've lost your childhood, your adolescence, your adulthood. You've lost your physical health, psychological health, your spirituality. You've lost faith, trust. Basically, you've lost everything, and you're afraid, and you're trying to survive in a life that does not make sense to you because of the abuse.
Oh, and Joanne, I want to turn to you now as a voice for the Catholic Church, because we have been hearing in the media that we have just blown this issue way out of proportion. What's your response to that?
I think that's very much a two-edged sword. On the one hand, I think we should be very thankful for the role that the media has played in exposing the problem, helping bring cases to light. At the same time, I think there's been a tendency to single out the Church for a pattern that was general. Especially at the time when most of these cases happened. No institution handled it particularly well. The pattern of concealment, trying to hide things, it was pretty general. And yet you only hear about it happening in the Church. So I think in that sense, yeah, I think it's been maybe not a proportion question, but a question of emphasis.
Well, I want to go to Father Len Artilia. As you sit with the victims, you know the clergy intimately. What was and what is this sexual abuse about? When a priest abuses those who trust him, what is it about?
I think fundamentally it's an abuse of power. The sexual part of it is perhaps the smaller element of it. It really is an abuse of power and an abuse of trust. I think Robert's experience when he says what he's hearing is certainly what I'm hearing. For me, the greatest single catastrophe in all of this.
Okay, and Robert, you did actually sue the Diocese of Sault Ste. Marie for exactly that kind of lack of trust and the violations. How did the church structure respond when you started launching legal action?
Initially, they denied, they called it an allegation, and so I went very public with the media conference. And from the process of, since the priest was deceased, it was a very lengthy process. Basically what I wanted initially was a letter of apology from the bishop, and he was refusing that. And finally when they did acknowledge the fact that the abuse had occurred and other survivors came out, I did get a private letter of apology. And then I had a gag order and I could not mention the letter. So what we did, we had another press conference and we asked the reporters to ask the bishop. And he finally admitted that he had given me a private letter of apology. So he broke the gag order.
And Father, is that You hear that kind of stuff all the time, don't you, in how this has been handled?
I'm afraid so. And it certainly is not the most helpful way of approaching it by any means.
Okay, we're going to talk about that more, but I want to just explain to our audience at home that in our studio audience, we have several voices experienced in this area, including the former chief of the Sex Crimes Division of Toronto Police. He has experience arresting a church worker in his own evangelical congregation, and we're going to hear his legal perspective of what needs to happen when the church faces this crime. But first, from Calgary, one of Canada's most outspoken bishops on facing clergy sin. You do have some history with this, Bishop. You did hire a convicted sex offending priest to work in a Calgary parish without telling the parishioners. What were you thinking when you hired Father James Neal?
I'm thinking I'm trying to save a human being who, on the recommendation of his bishop, who had paid his debt to society, who had gone through Southdown psychological testing. I did all of my due diligence. I put in place a mentoring system. The pastor, the parish council was informed. I didn't inform the whole parish. That was my fundamental mistake.
All right, now we need to ask what should happen when a convicted sex offender goes back to work in a situation with children, such as clergy would. And Gary Ellis, you are former chief of the Sex Crimes Unit for the City of Toronto. You, when you hear that a clergy was returned to his career like that, what is your opinion on what should have happened?
In 2003, there was a new law directed at organizations and negligence, section 22.1 and 22.2 of the Criminal Code. Says that organizations that put people in positions where they may offend are actually can be found as guilty as that individual. So if this person reoffends, the organization is at huge risk. On the side of these investigations, immediately, that's my experience investigating churches, and it's churches in the broad way. The first step seems to be restore the individual, feel sorry for the offender, and it's a twisted biblical discipline. And when you look at biblical discipline, the person is to confess to man and confess to God, confess to the victim, and then after that confession, pay the consequences. And after the consequences, it can be restored.
But that doesn't include, you're saying, putting them back in a situation of trust. You wouldn't go there.
It's ridiculous because we know pedophilia, the offenders will reoffend. It's like, how do you keep a dog from eating your dinner? You keep it out of the kitchen.
Okay, Father Len, I see you nodding. Mm-hmm. Do you agree that your priest should not be back in the parish?
I would agree with that. I think it's inappropriate to put someone who has already demonstrated an inability to fulfill their trust, their obligations, their fiduciary responsibilities, back in a situation that leaves them open to reoffending.
We will be back with more right after this.
But when we fail, individually or as a community, we must acknowledge that.